the whole session today, which reminds me, I think a problem last time was an answering machine. All right, so here we go. Welcome to session 2 of the disciple making R&D course. Today we're going to talk about a well-rounded approach to disciple making. So last week we kind of got into the idea of the problem of modern discipleship and how a lot of the knowledge-based approaches that we've traditionally used in Christian education came from the public educational school system, or public education system, which came from the industrial age and the assembly line, and that assembly lines are not very good. Well, they don't work in making disciples because people don't come to us the same, and people don't end up being exactly the same once they've gone through some sort of process. And this has kind of led me to believe the thought that disciples are not processed, that they're crafted. And today we're going to get into a broader expansion of what disciple making looks like. And then, like I said before, the first 2 weeks are a little more theoretical. But then as we get through sessions 3 through 6, we're going to get very, very practical on what does this mean and how does this affect our disciple making? How does this affect things that we're currently doing? What new kinds of things do we need to start? So we're going to dig in, and like I said, some of these things you may be able to take away from now. The others, I think, are it's going to build on what we talked about last week, and then build toward some of these practical sorts of things that we want to focus on in the next few weeks. But we kind of need to do this for a foundational piece today. All right, so let's talk about this. We're talking about a well-rounded approach to disciple making. And so in this, we're going to talk about what informs our spiritual growth. And then we're going to talk about discipling the whole person. And then we're going to talk about moving people from being a student to being a servant. So student, the idea of knowledge-based approaches. Servant, the idea of obeying what Jesus commanded. Because our obedience shows that we're a servant, not our, being able to recite what a servant is. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So here's the thing, and I'm going to take you a little bit way back to seminary in a way. You don't need this, but just so you know where I'm coming from, is that humans are whole beings, that we have material parts and we have non-material parts, that we have a body and we have a soul and a spirit. And so we get into, whether you're a dichotomist or whether you're a trichotomist or whether you're a holist. I don't want to get into this thing where it seems like parts is parts, but the idea that we have physical and non-physical parts of our being. And when our soul spirit separate from the body, we are indeed dead, right? We're no longer living on this earth, that we get a new spiritual body in heaven. And 1 Corinthians 15 gives us an example, gives us an idea of what that new spiritual body might be like. And if you, want to get into soul sleep or to be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord and all of that, you can do that, in your own fun time. But I just want to build a case for today. So the idea is that if humans are whole beings, then why do we only try to disciple the mind? Because there are so many more. There's a body, there's a mind, there's will, there's emotions, there's behaviors, there's attitudes, there's all kinds of things, all kinds of parts in this idea of being a whole being. And I think what we built the case for last week was just because we know the right things to do is simply not good enough. Because the things that we truly believe are the things that we do, not the things that we assent to. And if we just assent to a statement of faith, and our job as a church is to perpetuate an institution or to perpetuate Christian culture, then I truly believe that we have missed the mark as far as what our mission truly is, because we are not seeing lives transformed. We are not offering people to come and to follow us and let us rub off on them and invite them to imitate our lives as we're imitating Christ. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of us are in very large churches. And in a very large church, we tend to go to programmatic process-oriented methods of assimilating and trying to disciple people and all of that. And yet the reason that we're here is that we've realized that those programmatic kinds of things don't work and are not producing the people. So let's talk about how do we disciple the whole person. And so in order to do this, we've got to break down the parts a little bit and talk about what are all the parts to a person's life and how do we disciple that person in an integrated way. So the disconnect is this. The disconnect is between knowledge and actions and attitude, that we already know more than we do, but do we believe what we don't do? So are Jesus's commands optional? So if we look at the Sermon on the Mount and we go through section by section, then how much of that is in our thinking, in our outlook, in our actions, and how much of that is, oh, that's nice, that's Jesus, you know, that would be a nice thing to have, but I don't have time for that right now. So are Jesus' commands optional? I would say that if we are a follower of Jesus Christ, if we are a Christian, if we count ourselves as being a disciple, then obedience to his commands are not optional. And we need to not only pay attention to those commands, but begin to live those things out in a practical way. What do we miss out on by disobeying? And so if we're not following the pattern that God has established for us, if we're not obeying the things that Jesus commanded us to do, then where are we falling short and what are we missing out on? But then the other side of it we have to be careful of is how do we avoid legalism? Because I grew up in a church that tended toward legalism, and you know there were lists of things, and if you avoided the things on this list, then you were okay. The problem was, as with any sort of legalistic system, looking back at the Pharisees in the Gospels, the problem is that the list is always limited. The list is limited to things that we could practically do, but the list isn't broad enough to cover all of the things that we would need to do if we were forcing ourselves into a legalistic system. And I always used to joke back home that we could never belly up to the bar, but we could certainly belly up to the buffet, because that's how we got the belly. And so it's a matter of it's the same problem. It's just a matter of a different substance to fill that void, whether it be food or alcohol. It's the same thing. The only thing is we need food all the time. And some of you may, debate on the other one. All right, here we go. What parts affect disciple making? And so when we look at our lives, we look at the lives of other people. And I'm going to say us a lot, because I think that if we don't begin to think this way, if we don't begin to allow Jesus to disciple us in this way, then it's not really going to translate to the people that we lead. And so I'm going to say us a lot today, but I mean, all y'all, as we would say here in South Carolina. All right, so what parts affect disciple making? Our physical part of us, our attitudes, our outlook, our emotion, our personal background, our personality type, our relationships, our addictions, our habits, our strongholds, spiritual practices, multiplying ourselves, gifts and calling. Somebody the other day was saying, how do you get leaders to be better leaders? And it's like, well, if they start investing in a new leader, if it's not as developed as they are, if they have something they can offer to, then that certainly helps you to develop yourself, but you're also multiplying your life in another person, another leader. Gifts and calling, outreach and evangelism, developing our leadership ability. Some of these we're going to go into a little more depth than others today. But again, this is kind of a background and a basis for where we're headed in the next few weeks. So let's start with the physical part. So 1 Timothy 4:8 says, "For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come." Scripture doesn't say a lot about physical training or exercise or all. I know the King James says that physical exercise profiteth little, and my pastor back home used to say, well, and every little bit counts, right? But it's of some value. So a couple of things here. If we don't feel good physically, we don't feel good about anything. So we're tired, we're fatigued, maybe we're going through a health problem. If you don't feel good physically, you don't feel good about anything. In fact, Minirth Meyer, in their classic book, How to Beat Burnout, talks about that the first step in beating burnout is rest, diet, relaxation first. Then you go from physical to emotional. Then you go from emotional to spiritual. If we fail to prevent preventable disease, we can't just pray it away. And this is kind of part of what I'm facing right now is, going to the doctor, minding my own business, wanting to get my prescription refilled. And, they do blood work and they find, oh, your cholesterol is up. Oh, your glucose is up. And they threaten me with all kinds of nasty medication that I don't want to take. And some medication's good, but this I don't want to take. And so they said, well, the alternative is that, diet and exercise. So I got to it on that because I don't want to go that route. Now, my other issue requires surgery to remove, a benign tumor from my parathyroid. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But if you fail to prevent preventable disease, we can't just pray it away. We actually need to do something. And the reality is that it makes us feel better. So, we have to care for this earthen vessel. It's fragile, right? But not to an extreme, because nobody on this planet is going to live forever. The mortality rate is 100%. Everybody is going to die unless, Christ returns and, we get taken away. God determines the length of our lives. And so God knows exactly how long we're going to live. God knew that my grandmother would live to be 98 years old. God knew that my grandfather would die at 65 from, colon cancer, unfortunately. Wasn't a lot of health care back then. And he couldn't afford it. He was a poor farmer. But anyway, God knows the length of our lives. He's determined our days. And yet we can determine the quality of our lives. And a lot of it has to do with how we care for ourselves. And so it's our mind, it's our body. How do we take care of ourselves? How do we keep ourselves active? And I'm camping on this one a little bit because this is where I'm living right now. And so my focus is one of the things we learned, but I produced the curriculum for the Daniel Plan for Saddleback, for Rick Warren. And they have 5 F's, and one of them is focus. And my focus is that I want to reduce these levels in my blood test so that I don't have to take medication. But also I have a young family. My youngest is almost 5. My oldest is 16. So, I would be around. And, I'm a young 53, as you can tell. So diet, exercise, sleep, and rest. All of these things are important. And so how do we integrate that? Well, this is, I think I shared this last week, is I come down to, it's whatever I do daily, not just in the physical area, but in other areas. What you do daily ends up being, the course of your life. And so when you go through a day and you have a particularly bad day, you think, well, is this what I want my life to be? And so then maybe you imagine, what a good day would be. But I look at food now, and it's this daily discipline of, what I put in my body today is going to show up on the scale tomorrow and is going to determine whether or not I reach my goal the next time I go to the doctor. Exercise, again, just some kind of physical activity. I didn't join a health club, and I didn't go out and buy a new outfit. I wear the clothes that I already have, and I step out my front door and I go for a walk. And sometimes it's hot, and sometimes it's raining, And if it's really bad and miserable in the winter, which I live in South Carolina, we don't have much of a winter, then I'm going to go be one of those people that walk around the mall. Sometimes I walk around Costco, but then the problem there is all the free samples. So I got to make my daily decisions. Sleep and rest, we don't get enough sleep. And, if we don't get enough sleep, then, we're going to be grumpy, our outlook on life, all of that. And so, we have to take care of ourselves. So think about this. And again, I'm talking about myself with my own personal example and kind of where I'm at right now. But when I think about the lack of discipline in my physical body, decisions that I made for myself, things that I was doing, things that I was not doing, of eating whatever I wanted and not exercising, and, kind of hit or miss on the sleep part and not doing very well on the rest part. That the lack of discipline in toward my physical being in some ways reflected the lack of discipline toward my spiritual being. I mean, you think about, times when you've committed to doing a fast. And fasting, I mean, you're kind of surprised the amount of energy that you have. And I haven't done like a 21-day fast. I think the longest fast I ever did was 3 days. And but the thing that came to mind, during a time of fasting was how much I could do without, not just in terms of how much I could do without as far as eating goes, but also how much I could do without in general, things that I thought were necessary that weren't necessary, that I could actually avoid. And I know I'm camping here for a little bit, but I think the physical part of our body is important. And I think it's something that, and for me, it's especially important, being on the verge of medication here, which I don't want. And so, but I think it can also be telling of other things that we're dealing with, other things that we're facing, and reflect other areas of our life. The last one here is the idea of taking a Sabbath. Now, I know for all of you except for me, the idea of taking a Sabbath on a Sunday is impossible, because for you, Sunday is a work day. That's why you need to be a consultant. Then you can have Sunday off. And I just go to church with my family. I go to one service. I walk through the lobby. Nobody knows me. It's like a dream come true for an introvert like me. But anyway, but to find some time to Sabbath, and maybe it involves turning this thing off. It involves spending time with friends. It involves spending time to relax, doing activities, whether it's getting out or whether it's, sitting in a comfy chair with a book, or, whatever it is, that idea of taking a Sabbath. And so I used to have Fridays off when I was on staff at a church, and Friday was my Sabbath. And I didn't answer phone calls. I probably answered emails, because I can't get away from email. If I had an assistant, then the assistant could see any urgent email, then I would spend much less time on email. One day I'll get there. But this idea of getting ourselves out of the normal pace of stuff. And maybe that's removing yourself. I remember years ago we rented, we boarded our horse on some land that was owned by a pastor of another church back home. And he had an old trailer house that he put out on this land. He had 80 acres of land. And he didn't have a phone. This is long before the days of the internet. And I always thought it was kind of funny, because he had an easy chair, like a lazy boy, that was on the edge of his pond. And he would sit out in his lazy boy and he would fish on his day off. And if anybody urgently needed him, it was quite a drive to get out to his place. Now, I don't know what he did with the easy boy when it got wet or whatever. Maybe he didn't care. But he would go out and spend time in that place on his day off, and that was his Sabbath. And he could not be reached. And I didn't think, that wasn't too bad. So, and you say, well, I don't know if I could take a Sabbath because we have Saturday night services and all that. You know what? If you can't take a whole Sabbath, take half of a Sabbath. Get started somewhere. So I'm going to go on because I have other things to harp about today. All right, I'm tongue in cheek. All right, so our attitude and our outlook gives our lives meaning. And for those of us who are driven, we're doing our best, we're pursuing excellence in our work. We have a lot of things to do. A lot of times we spend our time looking at our task list of all the things we need to do, and we don't look at all the things that we've accomplished. And I think, in reflecting on counting our blessings and what God has given us, instead of focusing on what we don't have, we focus on what we do have. It's interesting that somebody did a study and they found that most people, when they finish time in social media, end up being a bit depressed, because the assumption is that everybody else is doing so much better than you are. And we tend to compare ourselves and become envious or jealous or whatever of these lives that they're posting, which, you sometimes wonder about how happy people are. There's a man here locally that a few years ago, he had 120,000 followers on Twitter when not very many people had that many followers on Twitter. And he was kind of a business guy, kind of a leadership guy. So I followed him. And, he would always post all of these positive, wonderful things. And it ended up that, he went through a circumstance of his life that was very, very difficult. And he fell into, a fairly extreme depression that nobody knew about till after the fact. And he ended up taking his life. And you thought, how miserable is it that you have 120,000 Twitter followers or friends or whatever, but then where are those true friends, when that you actually confide in? And most people don't post negative things about their life online, or people think you're some sort of a maniac. So we need to think. Our outlook gives meaning to our lives. We need to think about the things that God's blessed us with and things that God has brought us from. We need to take a kingdom-minded approach to things. I'm part of a small group network here in South Carolina, and I'm trying to get pastors together for a meeting. And what I've discovered is I can meet with one pastor at a time, but I have trouble getting the whole group together. I'm going to try it again this fall. I think I have a better chance at this now because of some people that have moved to the area that I know of that lived other places before. And I know I can get them together if I have a core group. But what I found is that a lot of pastors don't want to meet together because they're either suspicious of each other or they're jealous of each other, and they just really don't want to sit down and meet with anybody else. And it's like, it's all about the kingdom. We all go into the same heaven. We want to, avoid negativity and complaining. And so we think about negativity and complaining. Again, what is that betraying about our relationship with God and how we are growing as a disciple? So are we negative or complaining because we expect things to be different than they are, and yet we have no ability to change those things? Then I think we just have to accept reality and expect it to, reduce our expectations in that regard. Maybe we look at things negatively, because, are we lacking trust in God in some way? Of my complaint is from a lack, and I don't, focus on the abundance that I have. It's easy to be anxious for nothing when we have nothing to be anxious about, right? And yet the reality is that when we're anxious, when we're stressed, that's not the time to go talk to another person. That's the time to go and talk to God. Philippians 4, 6, and 7 says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will comfort your hearts and minds in life in Christ Jesus. And I have to say, those are probably like my life verses right there. My mother was a worrier. Her mother was a worrier. So I come from a long line of distinguished warriors. And that won't do any good except give you an ulcer. But again, what's our attitude? And going back, taking these things back to God, saying, God, I know that you said you would provide. I know that you said to be anxious for nothing, but I'm anxious. Well, anxiety, I almost thought it was a sin, like thou shalt not be anxious for nothing. But it's kind of if you think of your life as a dashboard, and anxiety pops up or anger pops up on that dashboard. We're going to get to emotions in a minute. then we need to ask ourselves, okay, I'm feeling anxious. So the resolution to this is I need to take this to God. I need to thank him for what he's done for me. And by prayer and petition, I need to give this to God. And then when we're anxious about it the next time, we take it back to God until we've actually experienced peace. So how long do you take it to God? You take it to God until you've experienced peace over it. And I know I'm telling you guys things that you know, but I don't know that a lot of people divorce kind of what they do in church from how they live their actual lives. And just basic applications of things in people's lives, because people are so busy and so stressed. I heard Tim Elmore share recently that the average high schooler today is struggling with the same level of stress as the average institutionalized mental patient struggled with in the 1950s. Now, it's backed by research. I don't know what his research was. I guess I have to go read his book to find that. But I heard him talking about this in a podcast. The average high schooler is experiencing the same level of stress as the average institutionalized mental patient was in the 50s. I mean, it's just ridiculous to even think about. I almost said it was crazy to think about, but I didn't want to go there with mental patient. All right. Avoid fake optimism. So, I mean, fake it till you make it. Yeah, maybe. But I mean, we need to hold on to, okay, this is really an issue. But we not only go with this is really an issue, but this is really an issue that, God can solve. Carl George said it this way. He said, do whatever it takes to keep yourself inspired. So read books that are inspiring, listen to stories that are inspiring, listen to, TED Talks, or the Leadership Summit is coming up, or go to a conference, not to duplicate all of the ideas of some successful church, but rather just to be inspired by what God's doing in that particular setting. So do whatever it takes to keep yourself inspired. And maybe listening to somebody, talking to someone, what have you. But our attitude matters, because you think that with all that God has given us and the fact that we've crossed from death into life because of salvation, that we should have the best attitude. We should be the most hopeful people on the planet. And yet we find sometimes we're bogged down by all of these other things. And, and I'm not saying go out and be Pollyanna. I'm the furthest from Pollyanna. I'm more of a, the glass is half empty kind of a guy. Steve Layden from Saddleback says, Alan, he tells me one time, he says, not only is your glass half empty, but it's also cracked and leaking. Which I guess makes it suitable for a consultant. They can kind of identify all of the issues and get to how to solve them. But we don't want to live there. Okay, let's talk about emotional things. How do our emotions inform our spiritual growth? And this is not something I think we really take into consideration. I think in recent years, the work that Pete Scazzero has done with emotionally healthy spirituality, and he has a number of titles under emotionally healthy, but talking about, things that are going on in us and things that we need to acknowledge and to take another look at. They may be things that are holding us back. They may be strongholds in our lives or what have you. But we need to ask ourselves things, because again, it's like, how do we know that we're not doing well as a Christian? How do we know that we're not doing well as Jesus's disciple? So I actually want to ask the question, put that question to the group. So in the chat window, and I mean, feel free to disclose whatever, I don't want to make you disclose something you're not willing to disclose, but how do you know that you're not doing well as a disciple? What's kind of a key indicator in your life? And so I shared that for me, one of the ways that I don't know is a lack of discipline, which is evidenced in the physical part, but it betrays kind of a lack of discipline in kind of other areas. So if you don't mind, share that in the chat. And if you want to, you don't have to, on the bottom it says to everyone. You can actually select my name and just share it with me, and I'll leave you anonymous. So how do you know? How do you know when you're in the weeds when it comes to growing spiritually yourself? Okay, so unwilling to serve people. What else? Too much TV or social media, escaping. I would say that I usually know when my anxiety levels increase, so I isolate. Okay. I appreciate you guys sharing this. So I think these are common things. My spouse tells me now, and we're going to talk about relationships in a minute, but I mean, your spouse is definitely a key indicator because nobody knows you better. The only person that knows you better than God is your spouse. Um, So how else do you know? How else do you know you might be? As an introvert, I pull too much into myself. Yeah. And I know that I seem outrageous and out there, but I'm doing three meetings in a row today, and what I know is that when I'm done, I'm gonna have to lay down. Um, so it's kind of funny being, introversion. It makes us great researchers, but sometimes the other part exhausts us. All right. Anything else? Any other ways that you kind of know that you're maybe slipping? Loss of energy or enthusiasm for the ministry I'm engaged in? Yeah, I think that's legitimate. Um, you know, it's like when you feel like you don't want to show up, but you're the pastor and everybody's waiting on you. You kind of have to. And feel like you have to be on your game or whatever. But these are good. I think these are good indicators, and we need to pay attention to these sorts of things. We also need to teach our people to pay attention to these sorts of things. And I think sometimes where we miss this, or what might trip us up a little bit, is that if we maintain a level of busyness that leads to exhaustion, then we just kind of collapse at the end of our days. But we don't take time to process things. And when we don't take time to process things, then we don't realize some of these things that you guys have mentioned here, or things that I've mentioned, because we just kind of speed bump over that and go on. And sooner or later, it's going to come up. I heard a speaker years ago that was talking about, she spoke on a regular basis and she lost her voice. And she went to her doctor and they couldn't figure it out. And they put her in the hospital and did some tests. And, they didn't, better insurance back then, maybe. And they tried everything and they were just left scratching their heads because they could not find any physiological reason that she shouldn't be able to talk. Her vocal cords were fine, her muscles were fine, her brain function was there, but for whatever reason, she was unable to speak. And so she said the doctor came in one day and gave her a pill. And she took the pill, and all of a sudden, she was able to speak. And she said, "What is this miracle drug that you've given me that all of a sudden I can talk?" Her doctor had given her a Valium. Because what her body was telling her was, if I can make it impossible for you to speak, then you will slow down. Then you will stop getting on planes and flying across the country and speaking everywhere, and all of this stuff. That if the body knew that if it could control her voice and shut her down, that she was going to have to rest. And she said at that point, she had to reevaluate how she was living and what she was doing and balance things out a little bit and cut back on the speaking because she was pushing it beyond where her body could go. Now, our bodies are naturally, meant to do this. And so, and this is something I share with pastors, and it is that, why do pastors want to quit every Monday morning? Why do they want to turn in their resignation every Monday morning? Well, part of it is, and part of this came from Archibald Hart, a class I took from him at Fuller. He used to talk about how he would go out and he would do a weekend conference, and he would be a Friday night, all day Saturday, Sunday speaking at the church. And he said that his most dreaded time in that weekend away was when he got back to the airport. Because then he would start to think about, evaluate himself, didn't feel like he was doing a good job, felt like maybe he should stop doing this. And you know, and he thought, why is it that I go, I'm doing God's work, I'm helping people, and then every time that the weekend ends and I'm at the airport ready to go home, this wave comes over me. And he came to term this post-adrenaline depression. And the idea is that when we present ourselves to other people, when we preach, when we, you know, do a talk, whatever, that we have to have a certain amount of adrenaline, a certain amount of enthusiasm to engage people, right? And that's just what it takes. You guys know when you speak. And then after you come out of that, then and you're done with that, then your body needs to recover from what it's been put through. And so he would feel, you know, depressed, discouraged at the end of a, you know, a great conference when he went to the airport. I used to feel this after my Wednesday night Bible study. And so what I discovered was that the key for me, because I usually didn't eat before I would speak, and so I was starving for one, and I would just, you know, torment myself with I could have done a better job, and I should have done this, and I should have said that. I shouldn't. I had more of I shouldn't have said that. And so what I started doing was I would get home after the Bible study, and then I would eat something, and I would sit down, and this is back in the 90s. I would sit down, I would watch an episode of LA Law, and then I would go to bed. And then the next day, I would evaluate what I could have done better. And so we're just kind of wired that way. My wife, when we first got married, she used to say, why do you have to take a nap every Sunday afternoon? And I told her, because our church had 3 services on Sunday morning, I said, well, the reason I have to take a nap is it takes everything out of me to be nice to people for 5 hours. So, I mean, our body's kind of made that way. That was extra. That's not even in the script today. All right, so let's keep going here. So, yeah, when we get to those places, we definitely need to pay attention. You know, do we pour high voltage chemicals into a low voltage situation? So what does that say? So you have a reaction, and you should have a reaction, but the reaction is way over the top and more of a reaction than you should have had. Why? Well, we need to go back and ask ourselves, you know, why did we react this way? And it could be that, you know, it's triggered something. This has happened with my children. This has happened with other people. And so there was something in that situation that caused me to react. But then the degree that I reacted was actually tied to something else that had happened. But I'd never really, either I needed to have healing in that instance, or I needed to offer forgiveness in that instance. But something was going on. I remember when my kids were little, you know, one of the things, I mean, innocent children, one of the things they do, you know, you wear glasses, they reach up, they grab your glasses off your face, right? That's a very natural thing because it's an object and they're close to you and they just reach up and grab it. And I would have such an angry reaction. I tried to stifle a little bit so I didn't frighten my child, right? But I had such an angry reaction that had nothing to do with them. It had to do with kids that I rode on the bus with when I was in junior high that would grab the glasses off my face and would toss them around and play keep away with my glasses. Of course, I'm freaking out because, you know, I need my glasses to see. I need my glasses to do my schoolwork. They're going to get fingerprints all over my glasses. They might break my glasses. And apparently I was a pretty easy target because they had a lot of fun with this. But looking back thinking, okay, now that it's been, you know, 20, 30 years since I was on that bus as a 12-year-old, why was it that I was having that reaction to somebody grabbing my glasses? So if you ever see me, don't grab my glasses. I'll punch you in the nose. But anyway, and that's just a simple example. But I had to go back and think about that again. And yes, they were picking on me, and that was wrong of them to do. So I needed to forgive them. The other thing was they were kids having fun on a bus that was a pretty boring ride. And they were having fun at my expense, and I needed to see them as kids and not some sort of monsters that were there to torment me. Now, there are other people that deal with far worse things than that, and I'm not, you know, going to go into all the far worse things in my life, but I'm just giving examples. We need to build in margin to our lives. And so going back and, looking at the Richard Swenson's book on margin, it's been around for a while. We need to enforce boundaries. We go to Cloud and Townsend, and we need to establish boundaries for ourselves. I used to take questions from my small group leaders, and I would write blog posts based on this. And one of my small group leaders said, how do I meet all of the emotional needs of my small group members? My blog post was, you don't, and here's why. That we have to enforce those boundaries. And I used to not want to see people suffer negative things, and yet then I realized that they weren't feeling the pain. I was feeling the pain because of them, and I thought I was trying to help them. I wasn't helping them. And so what I've learned now that I'm later in my life is that I shouldn't help people avoid their pain. They need to experience their pain because they're going to. I can help them process that. I can walk alongside them, but they have to deal with it because they're not going to change unless pain is a very powerful motivator. And so if they embrace that and realize this is something I need to change because in this relationship or in this situation, this is where things tend to go and it has a bad outcome for me. Well, they've got to learn that lesson, but I can help guide them through that. But it's their issue, it's their pain, and I don't need to take that on. Our personal backgrounds, so our family of origin, was there dysfunction? Were there generational issues? Maybe physical, sexual, or emotional abuse? Obviously, they have a profound effect on people's lives, and it's something that we need to process and we need to get healing from, because again, our reactions to people, our thoughts about ourselves, go back to all of this. Maybe looking at an Enneagram of, again, going back to Pete Scazzero, of going back and looking at things that happened in your family history of, marriages and divorces and deaths and, crime and, all kinds of stuff that in some way or another affected how your family thought about certain things and have been trickled on down to you. One of the things I found when I was, in this exercise, and I got to turbo through the rest of this because I'm telling a lot of stories today, was that I was never really close to my dad. And not until I was about 18 and I got this car that kept breaking down, and kind of the car maintenance brought us together, but we really didn't have a lot of common interests. And so then, now I have 3 sons and a daughter. And so when my first 2 sons, I thought, I want to be close to them. I want to have a good relationship with them, but that wasn't modeled for me by my father. So I'm not exactly sure how to do that. I was home one time visiting my parents, and my dad was telling a story about how when he was young, my dad was the 7th of 12 children. And when he was young, that his father was a poor farmer and plowed with a mule or with a horse, depending on what he had available. So imagine now, back in the 40s and 50s, and he's plowing his field. And my dad said that he would go out and he would walk behind his father as he plowed the field, row after row, that he would be out there walking behind his dad all day long. I said, oh, so that was you guys were just kind of hanging out, and what kinds of things did you talk about? And my dad said, we didn't talk. He said, I just wanted to be close to him. So now here's something that, a connection that was lacking between my dad and his father, because 7 out of 12, that's the ultimate of a middle child, right? So he doesn't know how to relate to his father doesn't know how to relate to him. And then we had our own distance. We're closer now than we've been. But as I was growing up, he didn't know what to do with me, and I didn't, we didn't have a lot of interests in common. So then now fast forward, and I don't want this to happen between me and my kids. So I have to make an extra effort, which seems crazy. You need to love your kids, you're automatically going to connect, right? And maybe you guys think, oh, I need to go see a shrink after this. I don't know. But again, it was that thing. It was generational, and there are a lot of generational kinds of things that you are your history. And so as your history, how do we redeem that? How do we grow from where we are? Personality types, how you're wired affects how you learn and grow. So we talk about introvert and extrovert, and it's kind of where where you're energized. Introvert, you're energized when you're not around people. Extrovert, you're energized when you're around people. Our core personality type. Are we somebody that's going to go out and conquer and take the bull by the horns by Paul and proclaim the gospel where it's never been, proclaimed before? Are we Peter that's, impetuous and flaky sometimes? But, you look at Peter, hey, I want to get off the boat. Peter draws the sword and cuts off Malchus's ear when they come to arrest Jesus. But Peter was the one that stands up on the day of Pentecost and say, these men are not drunk as you suppose, but this is that was prophesied by the prophet Joel, and gives this message, and 3,000 people are saved in a day. Are we like Luke and we're studious? And so Luke wasn't going to take what Matthew and Mark had written, but Luke was going to study for himself and create the gospel, and then of course the book of Acts. But again, being a doctor, kind of the precision, the perfection, taking it on to study, or Abraham and John. It's more of a relaxed, phlegmatic personalities, the types. Abraham said, hey, when we go into this country, if they think that, to Sarah, he says, if they think that you're my wife, they might try to kill me to get you. So just tell them that you're my sister, which technically she was a half sister. But again, it was kind of like, let's not rock the boat. Where's there trouble in other ways? Or John, who's the disciple that Jesus loved. John that didn't write immediately, but wrote toward the end of his life after he'd had a lot of, reflection. So again, we have different core personality types, and we're all kind of wired in a different way. Our relationships, so we're talking about marriage. And so somebody brought this up earlier. Your spouse is your closest accountability partner. And Gary Thomas tells us that maybe marriage is intended to make us holy rather than happy, of pointing out those things, those inconsistencies. I am wired more like Paul. My wife is wired more like Luke. So I function in generalities and in getting things accomplished. She functions in details. And so one time I was telling people, yeah, my son's about 1.5 years. And she said, no, he's 16 months. And I was just rounding. And but he wasn't 18 months. He was 16 months, but he was about 1.5 years. And I mean, it was the accusation was almost like I was lying, which I wasn't. I was generalizing. In our parenting, we see that the best and worst of ourselves in our children. The child that rubs us the wrong way the most is the one that's probably the most like us. The child, I just said that. All right, our neighbors. So Jesus said, second commandment, first is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, which it's great. It's easy to love God. And second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so what if your neighbor is actually your neighbor? And sometimes you're stuck with neighbors, and you have very good neighbors, friendly bases. If you know your neighbors, somebody hits the garage door and you go in, nobody knows their neighbors anymore. Sometimes there are neighbors that are having problems, and their neighbors' problems end up causing trouble for you. Those are neighbors that are more difficult to love. But what if your neighbors are not there by accident to be a nuisance to you? What if your neighbors are there because Jesus wants you to fulfill this command to love your neighbors as yourself? And to stop back and think, if my neighbor, if I was in the situation that my neighbor is in, how would I like a neighbor to help me? You think, I leave all that ministry, all that serving at work. I come home, I just want to relax. I don't want to, it's like we're kind of followers of Jesus 24/7. Rick Russo in the neighboring church says this. He said, we don't love our neighbors to make them Christian. We love our neighbors because we are Christian. So it's almost like a spiritual discipline. And so do we know their names? Are we praying for our neighbors? Do we help them when there's an opportunity to help? And some people know their neighbors really, really well. Some people don't know their neighbors at all. But again, I mean, Jesus took 631 commands of the law, and he said the most important is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So 631 boiled down to 2, and one of them involves your neighbor. All right, let's keep going. Friends, coworkers, your small group. Again, people who love you especially your small group, people who love you but aren't impressed with you, your close friends, people that will tell you the truth, people that if you say something, they'll look you right in the eye and say, that's about the stupidest thing I've ever heard come out of your mouth. And you're so relieved that it's not true. You know what I'm saying? We need those people. All of these are inputs into our growth and expressions of our attitudes and actions. So a couple other things here: addictions, habits, strongholds. I know these are all really big topics, but I'm just kind of want to give broad categories of all of these different factors have something to do and something to say about our discipleship. So addictions, bad habits, whatever, replace God in our lives. They're easy escapes. And so we need to say, I need to relax. I need to veg out. We all kind of need that. But on the other hand, is there something that I'm doing that's replacing God? So going back to my weight loss deal, that when I'm not necessarily hungry and I'm standing in front of the fridge or I'm standing in front of the pantry and I don't really see anything that's interesting to eat, but I eat something because I'm upset or eat something because I'm bored or, whatever else. It's like at those times, and this is valuable advice I got from a friend of mine, the best thing to do when we have an impulse towards something is to wait. We blow off steam by going to the mall and we buy things on credit cards, and then we have these big payments, and then we're stressed out because of payments, which sends us back to the mall to buy more. You know what I'm saying? All kinds of escapes. 75% of Christian men are addicted to pornography because it's an easy escape and it's available right there, and you escape. All sorts of things. And so the question, if we could make ourselves wait before I buy that thing, before I click on that website, before I eat that snack, what's going on with me? And we wait. And sometimes by waiting, we allow that impulse to kind of blow over. Sometimes by waiting, we stop and we say, God, what am I lacking that I think this is going to fulfill? Now, obviously, we're getting into alcoholism and drug abuse and things like that. Then it does get into the chemical nature of our body. And, it's a whole different thing. And there needs to be some specialization there. Addictions will stop emotional and spiritual maturity. I'm sure you have met people that in their early teens got addicted to something, and now they're, mid 30s, early 40s. They've gone to Celebrate Recovery. They've gone to treatment. They're breaking an addiction, and yet their maturity as if they were still 14 years old, because it kind of got put on hold all of those years that they were addicted, and they have to grow up in that. These are all symptoms. They're not root problems. And they're significant. Look at opioid addiction. I was talking to a pastor in the middle of Indiana. I'm talking about the greatest needs in his community, and he talked about the incidence of opioid addiction in this small community. They have a church of 100 people. It's mainly gray hair, and I know I have some of that. But an older congregation of about 100 people, and how could they meet the needs of the community? And what they found was that people, they could invite in, they would prepare a meal, and some of them hadn't had a home-cooked meal for a long time. And then to have the care, attention, conversation with people that accepted them and loved them. And this church of 100 mainly older people could cook, and they could be present with people. And they were making a difference in people's lives that were, caught up in drug abuse by offering these simple things that they were able to do. And I thought it was truly remarkable. In a rural church in the middle of Indiana. Spiritual practices. So time alone with the Word. Oh, no, wait a minute. We're getting to knowledge-based. Where you could stop and you kind of ruminate over a verse and savor it and allow God to speak to you through His Word. times of prayer, times of silence. We don't really practice silence, but even to practice 2 minutes of silence, and it's not transcendental meditation. It's being present with God, realizing that for 2 minutes, I don't have to think about anything. God doesn't require me to do anything, that the world is not going to end because I take 2 minutes to be with God. When I'm home and available, I sit on the couch to watch something. Inevitably, at least 2 of my kids, my 2 youngest, will come and sit by me or sit on me to be with me. If I go outside, pretty soon the whole bunch will be outside to be with me. And this is the kind of relationship we have with God, just to be with him. And I know God is present with us everywhere all the time, but in a different way. Again, worship, turn it up in your car and sing at the top of your lungs, keep your windows open. But our personal connection with God. And, and I've mentioned other, fasting, there's giving, there's all kinds of things that, again, are indicative of, do I trust God with my finances to the degree that I'm able to set aside a portion of them and give them to God when maybe 100% of what I have doesn't seem to be adequate? We're never going to have enough. We're never going to have enough because, honestly, if people in the U.S., if we could be satisfied with stuff, we would be satisfied, but obviously it doesn't. All right, I got to go quick. Here's an important point I want to make about spiritual practices is when we look at ourselves, when we look at the members of our congregation, everybody's busy. Everybody has full schedules. If we treat spiritual practices as if there's some kind of an add-on to our life, they're not going to happen. Oh, you need to get up a half an hour earlier. Are you kidding me? We're not getting enough sleep as we are. So if you took all of the available time in your day or all the available time in anybody else's day, and you say, when can we have spiritual practices? How can we go about spiritual practices? So is it on a drive to work? Is it on a break? When is it? Is it something that pops up on our phone? Because we're always looking at this. So wouldn't it make sense to have something on our phone? And I'm talking about not a big regimented approach, but again, something that's not an add-on to people's lives. So worship with the radio in your car. Turn off the radio or podcasts or whatever and talk to God. Turn off the sound and just spend the time talking to God, thanking God for what he's done and talking. I go on a walk, and inevitably on my walk I'm talking to God. And I'm not multitasking God, but it's just kind of like a walk makes you feel better about things, and it's time to myself. Some people ask me why I still mow my lawn, and the reason I mow my lawn is because it's quiet. And if anybody tries to talk, I can't hear you as the lawnmower's going. Talk to God, while you walk, so you hit physical, emotional, spiritual all at once. Outreach and evangelism, 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. So teach people to share the message, write out the story, practice the story, use the story. I have these wristbands. It's actually tied to a study that I've written for full disclosure. But the idea of Jesus came, he died, he arose, he ascended, he's coming back. And I had one of these one day, and somebody said, "Oh, what is that? What does that mean?" I said, "Well, this is the story of Jesus. Would you like to hear about it?" And I shared with them the story of Jesus, the message of the gospel, using a little rubber wristband. Other areas, we talk about multiplication. We're going to spend all of week 5 talking about hero making and multiplication, our spiritual gifts and our calling. We need to teach people about gifts. We need to offer a place for people to use their gifts. That could be in their small group. It could be in another area of ministry. And when it comes to gifts and calling, and this is kind of a soapbox, and I've got 1 minute, so I'm not going to turn it into my soapbox. This is not just to fill slots. Oh, we need people in the parking lot. We need people in the nursery. We need people. But what are people truly gifted and called to do? I think there's that place for people to serve where they're needed and kind of use their secondary gifts of doing what needs to be done. But how are we helping people embrace what God has gifted and called them to do? And helping them to grow in that way. And then developing our own leadership, helping people develop their leadership. One more slide. Concluding thoughts. There's no such thing as a balanced life. There's no such thing as a balanced life. We're not going to spend equal amounts of time in all of these different areas of our life. It's not even possible. But we should live integrated lives. That my marriage, my family, my job, my recreation, any downtime that I have, my physical body, my mental state, all of these things, because we are a whole being and because we are discipling whole beings, all of these things are inputs into how well we're growing. And I could memorize all of the Bible, but if I don't love my neighbor, why does it matter? We need to avoid add-ons. People are busy. So how could we do that? Could we do a short podcast to share with our people? Could we, I have a friend up in Baltimore. He and I are writing a book. And every morning I get a text message from him. He has an automated system I signed up for. And it's usually one text long, sometimes two. And it's a daily encouragement with a verse that I get every morning. It's pushed out to my phone. And you know what? I read it every morning. And I'm encouraged by it. And I think about it. It's just kind of this little nugget. I kind of call them my Christian fortune cookies. But anyway, we want to integrate these things into our normal life. So it's very similar to what, Moses wrote of God speaking in Deuteronomy 6 about training your children. That when you're in the course of doing normal things, when you're walking down the path, instill these things in them. So in the course of our normal life, without having to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go to a prayer breakfast, without having to, and these things are not necessarily bad, but for most people, they're not going to seem possible, or they're not going to be long term. But what are those things that we could do to integrate our lives and integrate teaching into that so that we are living out what Jesus commanded? Because that is the nature of discipleship. And so we're going to have to end there. Next session, we'll have a little more time for discussion. I actually have to go right into another meeting right now. But anyway, thank you for being here today. Happy 4th of July. And if you need any help with accessing the Dropbox, please let me know, because I know a few people have had issues. All right. God bless. Happy 4th.